record, so now I will, but that's okay. We'll, I'm sure we'll share who everyone is. Padma, I'm going to start sharing the screen. Again, everyone is muted, but feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question or type it into the chat. In the meantime, I'm going to share the presentation. So if you guys give me just a moment, I will do that right now. All right, let me know if you can see my screen.
Yep.
Great.
So thank you, Jerry. Let me start by thanking Jerry to for joining this conversation. So many of you are aware, as you signed up for this session, this is part 2 of a 4-part series. In part 1, we basically discussed on why strategy is important when you're talking about digital transformation. And Anya can give you locations where that recording is placed. So if you want to go hear that webinar, you're more than welcome. In this session, we are going to talk about the digital transformation initiatives, what, why, how, and who. So basically building a bridge between your current state and your future state, where you want, what are your long-term plans. And it's very critical to have that clear roadmap, or have at least a framework of how you can build that roadmap in order to reach that digital transformation initiative as a company. So when you look at digital transformation, can you go to the next slide, Anya? So from a high level perspective, when you look at digital transformation, you would hear from a lot of people, hey, implement the latest technology, go to cloud services, and you have become a digital company. Start an e-commerce business if you're predominantly brick and mortar, you have become a digital company. And some of the challenges when you talk to the leaders who have been in this conversation of digital transformation or digital evolution or stepping into digital space, you often hear about organization resistance to change, inflexible technology stack, and difficulty attracting digital profiles. All of these combined make it extremely difficult to break your legacy business model. And as we discussed in the previous session as well, like, breaking that business, having that new business model defined, or having a clear understanding of what does that business model mean for you as an organization becomes very critical. It requires, obviously, resources. It has a steep learning curve and willingness to change of all the above. Despite of popular belief, there is a silver bullet that's going to make these challenges disappear. That is not the reality when it comes to transformations. Based on my experience, what it actually boils down to, one vital aspect, which is focus. Organization that can maintain focus throughout the complete transformation achieve faster impact with less resources. Maintaining that focus sounds super easy, but it really isn't when you're bombarded by like everyday distraction on how to get the digital agenda. So you would hear a lot of companies who are going through this transformation saying, I have a day job too. And that's what it all boils down to. So this focus has to start from the top. Whether your leadership is digitally savvy or not, it still has to start from the top. The first and foremost, the company has to decide how digital can strengthen their organization based on your market context, based on the line you set out. What are you trying to prioritize from this digital effort that will support your company value? Typically focuses on areas strengthening your offering, your organization, or your business model. Digital capability come into play when you define your tactics for your offering. For example, if you are looking at harvesting data and improving your existing product offering, you're digitizing the touch points of your customer. But the key word here is decide, instead of shooting it from the hip. And you see that with a lot of organization where you would there is a conversation about digital agenda. There is a conversation about, oh, we're going to become a digital company, but there is no direct correlation to corporate value. What as a company I'm trying to achieve. The leadership has to outline the corporate value. Often a good idea to define a digital team who will follow up with the emerging trends. What is your potential? What is the marketing capability? What is your market positioning that can enable this transformation? Once a transparent, ambitious goal is set, then the senior leadership has to get the commitment of budget, because as you know, there are no free lunches. So you have to set a budget. And as I said, focus becomes even more critical at that point. And getting funding is the first step. The next piece is experiment. In spite of irrespective of what your digital goal, does your nirvana state look like, you need to eat this elephant one piece at a time. Don't go through a full-fledged digital agenda or go take a lofty implementation that might actually literally paralyze the organization on how how it can deploy the capabilities. You want to prioritize your digital capability based on the corporate values you're looking at. So when the conversation starts of how are you trying to, what is the value proposition? What is the corporate value? Your digital rollout expansion plan has to tie back to that value. By bringing together, and you have to bring together business people, technical profile, collaborate at a lab scale, have put a small functional team together that can identify particular digital agenda and run through that agenda and come up with an experiment that you can actually replicate in a live form when you take it completely live. The next step is you want to demonstrate, right? You want to demonstrate this digital capability, the lab test that you have done, and scale it all the way through and learn from it and understand. And this is the point where you can create corporate buy-in, showing value, how this is going to change, how it's going to ease the life of existing employees, or ease the life of how you market, or how your customers are reaching out to you. How are you positioning your brand value, or how are you even defining your brand value or rethinking about it? And then accelerate. Start multiple labs that are part of your agenda, and start deploying it one piece at a time. The transformation roadmap should not include more than 2 or 3 lighthouse projects, because at that point, if you end up including more than that, you are at the risk of overwhelming the system. And that's the one thing you don't want. So in order to make sure from cradle to grave, not necessarily grave, from cradle to implementation, you see these agendas all the way through and learn from them. Because you would see a lot of organization, irrespective of how big or small they are, you would have these digital agendas defined. And when they are implemented, either they are defined as huge, lofty goals, or they are defined as, even if they are at a small scale, they are defined and there is a start and an end. It is not a lifestyle. It is more of a project that starts and ends. And once the project ends, you lack that feedback loop that is required for you to eventually evolve. So you would see this is for those who are in the conversation of digital transformation, now companies are moving away from calling it transformation. They're saying this is digital evolution, because this is not a start and an end. When you say transformation, you kind of imply there is a start and an end. But when you say evolution, it's an ongoing exercise. You are evolving. And one of the major components as a company you need to hit is having people involved, them feeling empowered. Unless your employees, your people, your customers feel empowered, having this agenda go forward would be a difficult task. You have to make sure that the organization understands the value of these individuals, how their roles are changing, and how are they getting rewarded, not only from a perspective of, hey, you're getting rewarded because your life is going to get a lot easier with all this technology enhancement. Not only that, from a point of you are part of this dynamic digital team that is implementing this digital agenda. And how do you make sure you reward them for the out of the box thinking, being the thought leaders, being the pioneers who are trying to structurally break this silos inside an organization, or structurally trying to reinvent the existing business model. So when you want your digital journey to start, persistent focus on value creation and having a very agile mindset is very critical. We can go to the next slide. So this is basically a methodology that is highly implemented. It's used in any top business companies. It's a business model where you are trying to look at digital evolution or a digital transformation, and it's called opposite. So it's basically what it does is it's looking at orientation, looking at your clients, not only understanding what you as a company, what is your company value is also understanding what is the expectation of your vendors, of your customers, of your clients is from you, understanding the market landscape, and have the appreciation for different visions of how the company is seeing you and where is your value proposition. People understanding the behavior, that's trends, and the value that's expected. So take an example of Apple. Apple, it's a computer company. It first came with the concept of motherboard. It had a very robust PC and new operating system and everything. But Apple always had a component of innovation. It always had a component of out of the box thinking. So when Apple phones were launched, there was this expectation that iPhones are going to be completely different. And whether it was the expectation as drastic as iPhone launched and it becoming like a touchscreen technology and a very intuitive piece of technology. Not necessarily. I don't believe consumers expected that, but there was always this component of if it is Apple is doing, it is going to be something very different. And that was they were in the bleeding edge, right? So they've had the precedence as a company of what they are going to produce. And that's where orientation in people comes in, is understanding of you as a company. What do you stand for? And what is your consumer's expectation of you as a company? The next component is, I can see my own slides. Okay, the next component is the process. It is very critical. I have seen this over and over again, where companies go through, have a digital agenda, and they go through this process, and they forget about the existing reporting structures they have, the business model they have, the policies they have in place, and they move forward with technology implementation. They move forward either with a technology implementation or a new product launch, whatever that might be. They move forward with the agenda from a lens of either just a technology or either just a process improvement, one small process improvement, and they forget the downstream systems that are going to be impacted, downstream teams that are going to be impacted. So it's very important to understand a process map, lay out your current process. What are the systems these processes are touching? What are the teams these processes are touching? And what is the future process going to look like? The next component is objectives. Have very, very clear objectives, short-term as long and long-term. Because if you don't have short-term objectives, is basically how I said, in the previous slide, have an incubation unit. that's going to start this as an experiment. Those are your short-term goals. And when you look at long-term, you have to make sure that your goals are scalable. Your goals are in such a way that it's a continuous improvement loop, and you haven't deployed a piece of technology or you haven't deployed a piece of process that is going to eventually take a form of itself and have has no guardrails or no ability to meet the transformation objective that you had initially set yourself up to. Structure, very important, having very clear roles and responsibility defined. And how do these roles and responsibility translate for current state to future state? It's very critical that is defined as well. Next component is your intent and insights. What are the insights that you are driving from the experience you have deployed? So I'll give you an example. This is a very common theme for companies that have a very strong e-commerce presence. And what happens with this is there is a big concept of customer journey. How is the consumer entering your website? How are they interacting? And how do they check out? And that has a huge impact on how their loyalty towards your brand transcends. So their customer journey and your understanding of their journey and the experience you're providing them has a huge role. And how do you make sure that your consumer is always happy and you are giving them something they not only did not expect, but they were pleasantly surprised? For that, you need to make sure your intent are very clearly defined when you are making these customer journey enhancements or changes, or even if you're trying to keep it status quo, that experience has to be very consistent. And how do you draw insights from these experiments? Because sometimes what happens is, and especially in the digital world where we are living today, you have a pop-up company every single day, right? And this company is providing experience that better than the previous company. And how do you change that experience? And when these experiences are changing, these consumers are getting used to the new experiences. And if you have decided to stay status quo, what does that do to your value proposition that are you bringing to the table? Are you stale, or your consumer demographic has changed? Or are you trying to make a statement of saying, this is my brand identity and this is what I stand for? So those intents have to be clearly defined. Don't go through a transformation because everybody else is doing. Maybe you don't need a transformation. You just need an assertiveness with your brand. And those are the questions that insight and intent answer. The next component is technology. Obviously, it's digital. So you're not going to transform, have a digital agenda without the support of technology. And this is where it becomes very critical that you have strong technology and IT partners who can help through this technology evolution, whether it's only internal facing or it is internal and external both. The biggest component of this is execution. The execution, the transformation does not go in well unless the whole company is together and they are marching towards the same goal. Not to mention the leadership having the lead on showing the path, paving the path, removing all the obstacles to lead this digital transformation agenda. And one more critical component of that is how you make sure that you're measuring each single component of this execution and you're iteratively fine-tuning this. Because as I said, it's not a one and done exercise. It is an ongoing enhancement of your existing business model. So as I was speaking to the previous two slides, one thing you must have figured out is very consistent is change. John Kotter is a great author. He has spoken a lot about change management. He is the one who came up with the structured change management program, how organizations should go through change management. And this is basically his 8-step program, if I might say, for organizations to how have that culture of continuous change. Having a sense, because change is also, fortunately or unfortunately, is not a process of start and end. It's not like, it's not a workout plan, or it's not a diet, it's a lifestyle. So you cannot start and end a diet. It's not going to be like that. It has to become a new lifestyle if you want to transform. I'm sure you have heard this a lot. I am being quarantined right now. I'm trying to get in shape, and I keep reading this quote. So that's where this is. That's the mindset you need to approach change with. And one of the topics that we also dug deeper in our previous presentation is the mindset, the change in mindset, and why that is required. And that is one of the key component when you are talking about change. Create a sense of urgency, because a lot of time what happens is companies do have these lofty goals. 9 out of the 10 companies go through a budget cycle once a year. They start their budget cycle, they go, oh, I have this digital agenda, I'm going to enhance XYZ. Whether it's process improvement, whether it's a consumer experience, whether it's technology implementation, whatever that might be. They get funded, they move forward, it goes as a project, we started, we ended, and it's done. But there has not been substantial amount of impact in how your internal teams are operating, how the value proposition of the company has changed. So the impact is not significant. And when you turn around and assess the budget spent, 9 out of the 10 times companies go, oh, it wasn't very effective, or it was minimally effective, or it didn't create what I was expecting it to create. So one, define a very clear goal and agenda. Create a climate of change, create a sense of urgency, and understand why this is needed. Why, if we don't do this, what will happen? The next component is establish an environment where everybody feels empowered. Everybody knows what are the marching orders, what are we trying to do as a company, and how are we making sure that our value proposition as a company is changing in the global market. And then persistence, make it stick. Make sure that you are on it and you are continuously, as I said previously, focused. You don't deviate from what is the agenda for this change. Next.
I think we also have a question. Did somebody raise their hand?
Yeah, sure.
Maybe hold on one second, Padma.
I had a quick question here, right? So in the previous slide, right, in the climate management change slide, this is a great slide, right? So the first step, right, I think, just from a perspective of inertia, that's the hardest, right? You need to get everybody ramped up. Is there any guidelines or thoughts around how do we accomplish it? Do you run workshop within the organization? Do you have town halls? How do you communicate that vision of this is, or the first part of the second series as well, right? What are some of the strategies, communication strategies here to bring people on board?
So it's a two-pronged strategy, right? So one is you might have heard a phrase called WIFM. What does it have for me? Something like that, something along those lines. So internally, the people who are behind this agenda, they need to understand what is it for them in this? Why should they change? If the company's agenda, the company's value proposition is clearly defined, that should resonate the conversation of what is in for each individual employees. And then comes the conversation of how is this going to help the company at a global level? So the education, creating that climate is like a two-pronged approach, organization-wide, and the secondly, individual-wide. I know it sounds like, very hard to say at an individual level. I have 10,000 employees. How do I do this at an individual level? But it's a doable exercise when the individual goals are clearly defined, that is tying back to the corporate strategy or the corporate change in strategy that this digital transformation is going to enable. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
So the next slide, teams. Understanding teams. It's very, very important that everybody in the executive leadership is part of this conversation, because whether it's upstream, whether it's downstream, in some shape or form, their life is going to impact it. And it goes back to the question that Jay asked, like, and that goes a long way in getting buy-in. If you are involved in a process, you are going to have buy-in into, you have skin in the game, and you are going to make sure your clients, your suppliers, your partners are equally educated, your staff is educated to ensure this agenda is successful. So at a high level, leadership buy-in is extremely important, and it doesn't turn into, yep, IT is implementing a software, it's supposed to do something. We'll see when it happens. We'll see whether it works or not. So to avoid that, this goes back to the communication conversation is like, as a leadership team, you have to be in lockstep on the message being communicated and how is that going to enhance the company's value proposition. Next. So this is like, at a very high level. How do you take current state to future state? What does that map look like? So you have people, you need to communicate, convince, and drive through this change. You have processes that you need to understand current state, future state, and you have technology, and then you have culture. How are people approaching this problem? So as is and futuristically. And from a measurement perspective, how does that look like? And as I said earlier, eat this elephant one bite at a time. Phase your transformation out. Have multiple phases. Understand the risk and the opportunities in those phases. And obviously, a lot of organizations are part of, like, they have a lot of legislative guidelines, regulations. And if you are an organization that is touching any kind of customer information, that is bound to have these regulations, and how you make sure in the name of transformation, you don't shoot yourself in the foot. And continuous, that culture, that mindset of continuous improvement, and that's going to happen through measurement. How do you make sure you measure yourself consistently? So let's walk through, like, usually companies, how do they look at this transformation? When you're looking at changing the value proposition that you are bringing to the table as an organization, they fundamentally look at like 3 fundamental blocks. One is, what is my business model? Business model being whether I'm just purely a brick and mortar store, I'm going to be a purely e-commerce store, or I'm going to be an omni store. What is my positioning in the market? What are my operational processes? That's the second pillar where companies tend to transform a lot. What are my operational efficiencies to be gained? How do I make sure that I do more with less? That's a very common agenda that companies strive for every single year. And the biggest component is your customer experience. With the change in business model, with the change in operational processes change, how is my customer experience being impacted? So irrespective of what you do in these 3 pillars, they are tied with each other. They have to make sure that this upstream and downstream component is very well managed. So let's talk about the customer experience. So we discussed about, like, customer's journey. And this is a very quick snippet of, like, how do you map that customer behavior, and where do you have opportunities in these steps to understand, like, how do I impact that journey? Because whether you are making an operational change, whether you are making a business model change, this journey is bound to be impacted. And irrespective of what business you are in, you are servicing some kind of a customer, whether you are a direct to consumer business, whether you're a B2B business, irrespective of what you are. And fine tuning these journeys and understanding, having a very clear blueprint of your current journey and mapping out your future blueprint of how this enhanced, or if enhancement is not what you're going for, a different business model customer journey will tend to look like. So you need to have a very good structure of how you map this journey out. The next component is your operational efficiency. If you as a company decide, I have a flawless customer journey, I have flawless business model, but I do have an opportunity to gain operational efficiency. And this is where, like, I would like to emphasize that does not live in a silo. Your operational efficiency is the one that has, like, it's tentacles in every single component of your business, and which is like basically your heart of your business. That has to be, when you are fine tuning that, you have to very clearly define what am I trying to change and why am I trying to change, and how is this going to be impacting whether my consumer or my internal customer or my external customer or my staff. How is this going to impact all those components? And the next component is, if not this, what else? Why am I? So understanding these components and documenting these components and having a blueprint of these components is extremely critical for you to have any kind of change that can be effective. Same thing with technology. And I would, in this component, in this slide, I would like to emphasize one thing. Over and over again in my career, one thing I have seen is companies think implementation of technology is digital transformation, which is very inaccurate. I have launched an app. I am enabling a capability of people being able to buy through my app. That's a change of business model. That does not necessarily believe you launching an app has become a digital transformation. You have to transform your teams internally. How do they support this app? You need to have enough, whether you're a product company or a services company, ease of customer experience to ensure this app is successful. So there are a lot of components from a customer perspective, from an operation perspective, from a business model perspective, from regulations perspective, that will come into play before you can say, I launched an app and I'm a digital company now. So that's what I'm trying to emphasize, is technology is an enabler. It is not be all and end all for a digital transformation. What are some of the challenges that we go through when we talk about digital transformation? One of the biggest challenge that I have seen in my career is not having clearly defined goals. Not having clearly defined goals and not having a very clear measurement plan. The next component comes into is budget constraint. And I'm sure not only myself, everybody else has gone through the same thing. The conversation starts with a lofty goal. Someone says, oh, it's going to cost me $10 million. And the company goes, no, we don't want to spend $10 million on this transformation. We will spend $1 million. Now, instead of going and revisiting and saying why $10 million is important and why the transformation you're seeking cannot be accomplished in $1 million, companies tend to water it down, keeping the same goals, water down the output of this transformation and say, okay, we will just implement this, and forget about all the additional components that come in order to transform the company. And that's where companies go, oh, we went through a digital transformation initiative, it didn't go anywhere. We just have a new piece of technology now. So that is why it's very important to tie in your goals to your budget. You get what you pay for. You're gonna pay $150, you're gonna get a bicycle. If you're gonna pay $30,000, you're gonna get a car. So that's basically what it is. What are you trying to get for what? And if you want a car, buy a car. If you don't want a car, whether you buy a Kia or you buy a Cadillac, but buy a car. That's where the cost component comes into play. You're budgeting room to wiggle room. I'm not saying it's a hard and fast rule. I'm saying you do have wiggle room, but you have to say, I want to buy a car. You cannot say, I want to buy a car, and you say, I'm going to spend $150 on a car. You're not going to find a car. Then you're going to find a bicycle. So same component applies to talent management. You get what you pay for. You want digitally savvy expert people, you have to pay for them. And you cannot just do makeshift employees. So which play a huge role in your transformation as well. So the key takeaways, I've been saying this, like once you see this, it makes sense. Agility, very important. Change mindset, clearly defined goals, and a culture of continuous improvement. These are some of the very, very, very critical components. Without this, implementation of a digital capability or even thinking digital from an analog environment would be a very lofty exercise for companies to do and be successful on that. That's all the presentation. I think I have a quote after this. I love this quote. George Westerman, I don't know if you have seen, he has written a lot of books on digital transformation, on technology transformation. And this is one of the quotes he has said. And I truly believe when digital transformation is done right, it's a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. And when it is not done right, it is basically a faster caterpillar. And that's where you go back again and again. Make sure your goals are set up right, make sure it is funded right, make sure the change management is done right, and all the components come together when you're talking about this digital transformation. That's all the presentation I have today.
Thank you, Padma. So we want to turn this over to our panelists and as well as to you. We have a couple of questions, and we also welcome everybody else, all the participants, to join in. If they have a question, feel free to chat, unmute yourself, but I'll get us started. Jerry, I see you were playing with the lighting there. It looks great now. And the sun just met you right at the right angle.
I'm like,
That's right. But I wanted to ask, as you're thinking about all the digital transformation discussion that Padma was just talking about, can you talk a little bit to us about the role of technology and strategy, specifically when it comes to customer experience, sort of the golden standard, right? Of like, is the customer getting what they need?
Sure. I mean, I can't answer the question without sounding a little bit like, ubiquitous and all encompassing, but I start with the base of what do you mean by customer experience? And that answer will sort of change what you're going to actually look for in a technological service, or how you're utilizing existing technology. But are we trying to understand behavior of our current customers? Are we trying to quantify and aggregate that behavior in existing customers and put them in buckets? Are we trying to predict behavior, and like we have a core segmentation, but we're trying to then sort of stay one step ahead of them and understand what they're going to be doing next, and then utilizing that information to provide recommendations. So I think depending on where you are in the cycle of marketing, and that's how your technology is going to assist you in answering those questions and highlighting your customer experience, right? At Bloomingdale's, we were talking about how do you take all past purchases that customers had and then are able to make recommendations in terms of future apparel to stay top of mind, to have the brand stay top of mind, to have other to have designers stay top of mind with your core set of people. But at Bloomingdale's, it's a much more mature business than a young upstarted business. Where I deal with now is sort of as appliances, and we don't need to make recommendations. We don't need to sort of have predictive analytics. We need to collect what are the behaviors of appliance buyers, because nobody has collected that in the past. And so our ability to service and to manage the customer experience really depends on where you are as a business.
Thank you. That makes complete sense. That it also depends on the company that you're and what the ultimate goals are. So thanks for that. So I'll ask this question, and again, please chime in if anybody else has something they'd like to say. Unmute yourself or chat it in. But another question that we wanted to ask you, Jerry, and then Padma, if you want to chime in as well, is when companies say digitization, they move very quickly to AR or VR conversations. How important do you think it is to look at the latest and greatest?
Padma and I have talked about this a lot. And I think when you're dealing with a leadership team that sort of doesn't understand how to get into the nuts and bolts of digitization and technology, they jump to this like pie in the sky, almost like Jetson like attitude, right? Like I want a device that's able to like it's virtual reality that then dresses you and you can select a million products and then order online and then do it. It's all like flash in the pan, like this imaginative stuff, which in one hand is cool. You know, if we could accomplish that, it'd be really interesting. But very few organizations are at that level where they can do that. Right, because it goes back to the basics of what, you know, I was talking about a little bit before, right? You know, where are you in the maturity cycle of your business? Are you still just collecting data, you know, of your best customers? If you don't know what your best customers are, how can you choose a VR product that really would address that need, right? So I always ask myself, okay, well, what are your business needs? What are your personal goals to accomplish from a technology standpoint, and vis-a-vis your customer and the customer experience? And then if AR and VR are the appropriate solutions to that, then okay, sure, go ahead to it. But I think a lot, like 80%, 85% of companies can just, if they just kind of understand acquisition, conversion, engagement, those kind of things, like, and pick technologies that address those in particular, you can accomplish a lot more than just like a flash in the pan VR experience.
I totally agree what Jerry is saying. Like, you know, it very much depends on what your organization, what your corporate agenda is, what are you trying to transform? And it also depends on, like, you know, where are you in this maturity curve, right? Understanding, like, you know, your consumer behavior and what is the consumer expecting out of you. Currently, like, you know, with the beauty company, there is a very innate, like, you know, big conversation. Everybody feels we have an innate need to enable AR on site. Now, the question that we are trying to answer is, who is your consumer? This is your average consumer age is 55 years old, lady who is picking your products up from either a drugstore or Walmart or Target. The odds of her putting her computer or a phone camera on her and testing, how does this lipstick look on me, is not a doable. It's not something that is going to happen, or it is not something a realistic expectation, right? So this goes back to what Jerry just said, like, you know, what is your acquisition? Are you trying to change your consumer profile? Which every company wants millennials, right? So you want millennials, and yes, would they do this? Yes. But how is your value proposition as a company has changed to have that millennial come and shop at your store or shop your products? So those are it all comes back to, what are your goals, and how are you trying to achieve that? And AR, VR, all these technologies are just enablers for your goal, not necessarily the goals, if that makes sense.
So you're really talking about, it's much difficult to become an agile organization, right? So if your target population is 50 plus audience, right? You're selling product like AARP product. I mean, that's the biggest spenders, which I've surprisingly learned lately. All of a sudden, introducing AR and VR might not be the right strategy, right? Because they're not your target audience. All of a sudden, you're not going to attract 25-year-old millennials to your brand because you've been traditionally selling to this um, older group, right? Interesting.
To me, it's about like what is going to make the most impact to the bottom line in the most efficient way possible. I'll give you an example. Like do people remember Pokemon Go? I guess it's still a thing. So we were trying. So when Pokemon Go first came out, they had the AR experience of like combining your real life experience with capturing these Pokemon. And they had, for those of you who don't know, they had these opportunities to drop Pokemon stops, which were like these collective markers for people to gather in. And so at the time, we were talking about, how can we, again, flash in the pan, like how can we utilize this to stay, have the brand stay top of mind and, gather people into the store and really combine it with our brand philosophy. And I had to push back so hard because participation in this, I mean, yes, it would be a cool thing to like, all right, it's the actual Pokemon Go was top of mind with a large portion of the population, but how does that forward the company's goal? Are you willing to spend $100,000 for a flash in the pan technique just to be top of mind for a week, or can you spend that $100,000 and do something less flash on, right? And raise the ROAS on your affiliate or your paid search or even your content management systems, right? So is AR and VR is it really going to provide you the ROAS better than a traditional digital tactic?
It's not the next fancy thing. Does it reverse engineer back into your core?
Yeah.
I think what the panelists, what Jerry's saying is also back to what Padma said about what's your ultimate goal and how do you back into that? Not just go with the shiniest, latest, greatest. What's the goal for the brand and how do you go there? And that doesn't always say with what is happening at that moment. What's the most exciting thing? And that's a really good point, I think, especially with everybody has some kind of a budget, right? There's a limit to everything. So use it wisely.
I have a whole bunch of questions. I don't want to use this as a discussion, but if permits, I would ask like one last question though.
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
I was recently seeing a documentary about L Brands, and I find it a fascinating story, right? It's like a small shop. They own, a lot of people might not know this, small shop out of Ohio. They own Victoria's Secret. They own Abercrombie and Fitch. They all own these high trendy brands coming from a small town, Ohio, right? And they had this astronomical growth. He literally invented this fancy lingerie industry altogether, right? And then all of a sudden around 2010, the consumer taste started shifting, right? So how does something like digital transformation play into it in terms of how do you react to an environment like that? Or is it even possible? Or at that point you say like, you know what, I tried.
So let me take a stab at that. I consulted with them, Victoria's Secret, for a while. So I know what they were going through internally. So I'll say this. I think where there was the slippery slope was they reacted very late. This Victoria's Secret had this legacy presence with their shows, with everything. They aspired a luxury lingerie line, right? And then what happened? You had these mom and pop lingerie lines popping up in Kohl's and everywhere. It slowly started becoming not a normal, but it is an occasional lingerie line. I have Valentine's Day, I'll go buy a new lingerie. It was not a day-to-day thing. So they started, the brand had an aspiration of a luxury brand, but they also wanted the volume of your day-to-day brand. And that's where they didn't marry up the customer expectation and change their brand experience according to the customer expectation. And that's where I think it was too hard of a catch up for them to come back and start taking the lead in that space, because you had so much threat of entry in the market. You have too much entry in the market with these indie brands coming in. The next component was you were such a legacy that you were having trouble transforming yourself quickly and making yourself accessible digitally, or making yourself accessible more simplistically. And the third thing was your value proposition versus your pricing did not match, because the indie brands came in and caused so much disruption. So this was a classic example where there was technology, there was people, there was process, there was product, there was business model in stake that the company had to transform all that together. I entered them as a contractor, when they were trying to change their technology stack and understand analytics. And at that time itself, they were pretty late to the game, right? Because you're still trying to analyze a seasonal business. Your business has become a seasonal business, but you're trying to analyze that as a day-to-day brand. So there is a fundamental disconnect between market and what is the brand's value proposition. And I think that's what happened with them at a larger scale.
Lines, right? Like the analytics piece of it, if they had better digital transformation earlier, they would have had a real-time idea on how the market is reacting to their product.
I'll add to that in the sense that they, two things really. One, Padma said about legacy, and then two is what she had on her slide actually is the need for change and senior executives understanding what that is. If we're talking about L Brands and Victoria's Secret specifically, this was built on the backs of basically 4 or 5 people. People who had a little bit of luck, and they, Victoria's Secret fashion show blew up, and they were most known for changing lingerie into runway fashion and getting the largest engagement on network television every year after year. And I think it just became ingrained in their mindset that this was what the brand represented. The fashion show, sexy angels, and upscale underwear. And I think leadership didn't see the need for change because they came up with it. So there's inherent bias in terms of all right, well, this is what I created. And as the years progress, and you have all these other smaller scale lingerie stores, and better able to service their customers using technology to understand sizing and fit and all this stuff, they really lost ground on that, and they still year after year think that there's nothing wrong. And so there's not a willingness to listen. And so when you're talking about digital transformation, it really has to be convincing up at the top to create an environment that then you can say, okay, well, we need to organize in a certain way to get to our end goal of whatever that looks like, right?
Great.
Thank you, Jerry and Padma. And thanks for the question, Jay. We have about 1 minute left. If there's anybody else that wants to chime in, please feel free to do that. We want to recognize the time and don't want to keep everybody over. And if there are no other questions, feel free to, again, reach us online, follow up with any one of us via email, find us on the web and LinkedIn to make sure that we are connected and that you join us in the next 2 weeks. So we're doing these every 2 weeks. There's another one 2 weeks from now on the 18th of June, and you can sign up through Meetup or Eventbrite. Thank you so much for joining. Jerry, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. And thank you, Padma, for the hard work as well. We will see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jerry.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Padma. Thanks, Maiden. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.